So good morning, everybody. I will start on our chapter about the sources of demographic information. I just started talking a little bit about it in the last class, pretty much saying that here we're going to focus on three major ways in which people capture demographic data. And then I will show some examples of what are called the national censuses, registration systems, and surveys, both in the lecture, but also afterwards I'm going to show you some websites that make available for us data from all these different sources. And the interesting thing about these websites is that you can have both really detailed data, like micro data, as we explained here in the class. If we have a national census that implemented questions with all people in a population, we have one row for each person. But also these websites already provide aggregated analysis of it, already providing us some tables with summaries of these results. So overall, we're going to discuss national censuses, those questionnaires that are implemented to the whole population of a country in a specific year. Usually they are short questionnaires because you have such a big population to get data from. Registration systems are ongoing systems that collect information about the population, such as data that we collect about people being born through birth certificates and people dying through death certificates, and surveys, which is more detailed information that we collect about our target population. But in that case, since I don't have as much money and I want to have more detailed information, instead of collecting information about everybody in my population, I select a sample of that population and then I implement the survey, okay? So national censuses are the total process of collecting, compiling, and publishing demographic, economic, and social data related to a specific country or to a specific territory in a specific time point. And the idea is to get data about the size, composition, and distribution of the population. In terms of demographic characteristics, we ask questions about how many children they had, whether they had children, they had a child last year. And we can also collect information about mortality of household members, educational attainment of household members, employment, and several other economic and health outcomes. And also information on country of birth, citizenship, language, migration, and ethnic heritage that can all be collected in these national censuses, okay? When did the census start? So has been already a long history of census being implemented. The first censuses were in ancient Egypt, China, and Rome. And the first modern censuses in large countries, they were collected, for example, in the US. The first demographic census in the US was in 1790, in which like 3.9 million people were counted. And as I'm going to show you, it pretty much differentiated between specific subgroups of the population. For each one of the states in the country at that time, or regions or provinces, you counted how many people were there, but for these specific subgroups. Free white males, by whether they were under the age of 16 or above the age of 16, to determine if they were on age to serve to military obligations. And also, it counted how many women there were in the country in each one of these regions, and also how many slaves, right? So we have specific subgroups of the population, pretty much more related to, in this case, race, sex, and age specifically for the free white male population. Another example is the 1787 census of the Kingdom of Spain that counted 10.4 million people at that time. And by 2014, counted all censuses, all countries that collected census between the years of 2005 and 2014, more than 230 countries collected census about their population. So for what is called the 2010 census round, census collected between 2005 and 2014, more than 230 countries collected data about that population, and that's around 96% of the world's population. Only 7 countries did not complete the 2010 census round: Eritrea, Iraq, Lebanon, Pakistan, Somalia, Uzbekistan, and Western Sahara, for different political economic reasons and historical reasons as well. But overall, we have all these censuses collect information about all households and aiming to collect information about all people living in the country for most of the countries in the world by now. So just to give an example of the first American census that was collected in 1790, so assistant marshals listed the name of each head of the household and the number of persons in each household of the following subcategories. Like I said, free white male of 16 years or higher to assess the country's industrial and military potential. Free white males under 16, free white females, all other free persons, and slaves. So for each one of the regions in the US, you had these 5 subgroups of people being counted. And this specific information that I'm going to give you here comes from, not from the textbook, but comes from the Census Bureau website. So all this information here, more specific about the census, the American census, comes from the US Census Bureau website. This is the result from the 1790 census, the count. So you have all the different districts or states in the US at that time. And then you have here the free white males of 16 years or higher, free white male under 15 years of age, free white females, all other free people, slaves, and total. So you have discounts for all the areas, and you have around 3.9 million people being counted at that time. So this is just to show, and this table I got exactly from the Census Bureau website as well. So this is just to show that the concern of the government to understand the size of the population, the composition of the population, it has been there already for centuries, okay? The US census, what is called the US decennial census that happens every 10 years, up to the year 2000, it had a short form and a long form, right? The short form had really few questions being asked to people, and the idea that it would ask these questions from all people within all the households in the US, right? So the short form questionnaire included basic questions. So name of each person living in the household, the sex of each person, age, race, ethnicity, relationship of each person in the household with the head of the household. So was it the head of the household, the spouse, the child, grandchild, or the father or mother, and so on? And also whether they owned the household or they rented it, or it was an occupied household. So up to the 2000 census, you had this short form with really limited number of questions being asked for all people inside the households in the US. But also you had the long form. Then the long form had questions about income, about fertility, about migration, about veteran status, and all different characteristics of these people, much more detailed information. And this long form was implemented in the decennial census up to 2000 only for a sample of the population. The long form, even at the time of the 2000 census, although it was part of the census, and census mean I'm counting everybody in the population, but the long form, it was not implemented for everybody. It was a sample of the population, but a sample that was representative about the whole population, with the idea that I'm selecting specific people, but I'm being really careful, so I'm following a survey design with the help of statisticians, that I will collect information about all different kinds of people in my population, and that specific subgroup of the population provides me information about everybody, right? But it's, in the 2010 census, and also in the 2020, we don't have the long form anymore. The long form now is implemented through the American Community Survey. So in 2005, the American Community Survey implements the same long form questionnaire that had been implemented up to the 2000 census, and also to a sample of our population. The American Community Survey was implemented in some states before 2005, but 2005 is the year that usually people use the American Community Survey, the ACS, to actually analyze data about the whole US because it's more reliable. And then every year after that, 2005, 6, 7, and the latest available data from the ACS is 2019. The 2020 ACS had a really low response rate, so this because of the pandemic. So the Census Bureau is still working with the data before it's fully available to people to analyze. And the idea is that both in the short form that now is implemented only through censuses, and long form that's implemented through ACS, one person in every household provides information about everybody else. So nowadays, what happens is that people get it through mail, the questionnaire in paper from the American Community Survey, but there is a link there and also a code that you receive that you just go to that website and you can complete the questionnaire online. If you don't have access to the internet, or if you don't want to use the internet for that, you can fill out the questionnaire in paper and send it back by mail for free to the government, okay? So this is an example of the questionnaire of the census. That's the 2020 census, the latest one. And first question, how many people lived in the household exactly on April 1st? So April 1st is called the census date. Whenever someone asks, oh, what's the census date for the Census Bureau? It's April 1st. So the idea here is to provide information of people that were living in the household, not exactly at the time that they received the questionnaire. All the questions are related to people living there exactly on April 1st. And if I receive the questionnaire in May, let's say in June, and let's say that in May, my brother lost his job and started living with us. My brother moved in May. I'm answering the questionnaire in June. The question is about April. So when I report here the number of people, I do not count my brother because he was not living there in April. And if someone in my household died in May and I received the questionnaire in June, I have to count that person here because that person was alive in April, okay? And were there any additional people staying here on April 1st that you did not include on question 1? Is this house, apartment, or mobile home owned, rented, or occupied? And also you can provide the phone number just in case the Census Bureau wants to clarify any of your answers, okay? And then it comes the questions for each person. And again, the person answering the questionnaire, either in paper or through the link that they provide, gives information about everybody in the household. So name, sex, what is the person's age, ethnicity, pretty much asking if that person is of Hispanic, Latino, or Spanish origin or not, and you can detail that here. What is the person's race? And this question about race, you can now mark more than one box. And these questions about race and ethnicity, whenever I show you the graphs about demographic indicators by race ethnicity groups, that information is a combination of these two questions, right? So everybody who reported being Hispanic here, it's one subgroup of the race ethnicity group. Those that reported no and white here are non-Hispanic white. No and black, non-Hispanic black. No and American Indian and Alaska Native. No, non-Hispanic American Indian and Alaska Native, and so on. So you create all these subgroups of race ethnicity, basically using these two questions here. And you can also have the subgroup of non-Hispanic multi-race. Non-Hispanic multi-race are those people who answered no here and answered at least two of these questions, of these options here, okay? And this question raises about these two questions about race ethnicity, the Census Bureau, before the 2020 census, they made a series of studies trying to think about a better way to ask the question. They were suggesting combining them, so you'd have just one question about race ethnicity, because they realized that a lot of people who answered yes for Hispanic here, they would answer some other race. So this question was not being really helpful. So they wanted to combine these two questions about race ethnicity, but it's still allowing people to answer more than one, to mark one of more than one box. So they were planning to combine, and they were also planning to add another subcategory of Middle Eastern and North Africans, which is a group, a race ethnicity group increasing in the US through time, and there is no subcategory there. And that would be good for us to know where those people are living, their life conditions, and so on, because their process of integration to the American society is different from the white or the African American population, for example. But then after several studies being done and the Census Bureau coming up with the suggestion before the 2020 census, the previous federal administration said, no, we are not going to combine these two, and we are not going to add the subcategory of Middle Eastern and North African. And more detailed information about that, I provide in the extra lecture about race ethnicity in our course website. And there I have like all the official documentation from the Census Bureau saying that these were our options, all our scenarios for this questionnaire, but then nothing was implemented. It was always a major criticism that scientists have about the previous federal administration. The US is that all these major decisions were all based more on ideology and politics instead of science. And our concern here was to better understand the population, was to better capture specific subgroups of the population. The previous federal administration pretty much ignored that and continued the way that it is. And then we ask the same questions to the other people in the household. So that's still the questionnaire from the 2020 census. But here, we add there are some other questions. Does this person usually live or stay somewhere else? Like as college students, for example, or people out for military assignment. And here is the question about the relationship of each person with the head of the household. How is this person related to the person one who answered before? Is this person here opposite sex husband, wife, or spouse, opposite sex unmarried partner, same sex husband, wife, or spouse? And then you go to son, daughter, stepson, and so on, right? And then the same question, sex, age, date of birth, just to see if that information was provided correctly, ethnicity, and race. And then those questions here, the person answering the questionnaire provide them to everybody who lives in the household. Cool? And I mentioned to you that all these questions being done here in the 2020 census, they relate to the census day. That is April 1st, in that case, 2020. And that is important for the way that we collect the data. Like I said, if someone enters the household after that, that person is not supposed to enter in the count. If someone dies after that date, the person is supposed to enter in the count, like in the examples that I just gave. And that is one option that the countries make about how their census is going to be. They decide about whether their census will be a de jure or a de facto census. What is a de jure census, which is the case of the US and Canada? It's count of persons based on their usual, normal place of residence. In the US, people answer questions related to their place of residence on April 1st. It's not on the question about how many people live in that household. It's not about who were there in that time that you received the questionnaire. It's actually based on information about people who live there in the date of reference. In the US, the date of reference has this name, this nickname of Census Day. And it's the usual people who live there. What's the other option? The de facto census counts person based on their location on the day of the census, on the day that the people received the questionnaire. The de facto census is more common across the world because it's easier, it's cheaper, right? Once the questionnaire reaches a household, whoever is there at that time, they will be counted in the questionnaire, right? It's not related to a date, a specific date, a standardized date of reference, such as the census day in the US. So you have these differences in the way that you classify residents of the households that they are counted in the questionnaire. So that document here in our course website that I included under this chapter, Population and Vital Statistics Report from the UN in 2006, doesn't matter if it's an old document. The idea is just to show the list of countries that collected census and just informing if their census is de jure or de facto. So the de facto population consists of all persons who are physically present in the country or area of the reference date, whether or not they are usual or legal residents. The de jure population consists of all usual residents, whether or not they are present or not, right? If someone left after April 1st, someone died, or someone entered, those people are not counted based on our date of reference. And then if you go further here on this document, then you see the list of countries, and these are census based on 2003, 2004 data. For Algeria, for example, is a de jure census, and the date of reference is June 25th, 1998. For Angola is de facto, is December 15, 1970. The date of reference here. Oh yeah, so this, in this case, of course, it's not exactly from 2003 or 2004. It's the latest data that the UN had at that time, okay? And for the US, if you keep going, you have right here, April 1st, 2000, it was at the time of the 2000 census, the estimated population, a de jure census. Brazil also. In Brazil, the date of reference is August 1st, 2000. Argentina is a de facto, and that's November 18, 2001, okay? So all these different dates of reference and the style of the census being de facto or de jure. So that's the reason that I put this document here, so you can see the differences across countries on the style of the census. Cool? In the US, or in general, let's start by in general, why countries have censuses? When we understand the characteristics of our population, we collect data and we see what are the major areas that face a high percentage of the people below the poverty level. We see people with low levels of education. We see people without access to health services. Then we can implement policies to improve their income, their education, and availability of health services, right? So the census can be useful as a source of data to implement public policies. We can also use census data to estimate, if there are questions about crime and death, to estimate crime and death rates, per capita income. Even private businesses can perform market analysis about the specific areas, like the census. Since they collect information about everybody in the population, we have such a big number of people, large number of people answering the questionnaire, that we can do the analysis even for small geographical areas, because we have so many people answering the questionnaire. And then private companies that want to decide whether they will start their businesses in specific areas, they can analyze the census data. In the US, the census, it has only those specific questions. It doesn't have income, so it's pretty much just age, sex, race, ethnicity, and whether people own or not their household. But it gives a lot of information about the population for small geographical areas. And if you want to know in the US more information about these people, you have to go to the American Community Survey, and then the sample size is smaller, so you cannot analyze it for smaller geographical areas. You can estimate new patterns of household composition, cohabitation patterns, as well as whether the households with same-sex partners has been increasing over time. So there are a lot of possibilities to use census data to understand the population. But formally, in the US, the principal reason, justification for census, why they are implemented, is actually written in the US Constitution. Is to provide population counts to be used for apportionment of the House of Representatives. And that creates a lot of political debate in the US, right? First, based on the population size of each state, the number of representatives that state will have at the House will be based on the size of the population of that state. So in Texas, for example, that you have a growing population comparing to other states, what is expected is that in these coming decades, the population size of Texas will increase in a faster pace than in other states in the US, and then you tend to have more representatives from Texas in the House of Representatives because of increasing population size. And more than that, based on population size and composition within states, the congressional districts are drawn in the US. All right, so the congressional districts are drawn in the US based on population size and composition. The problem about that is that a lot of state legislators have been using information from the census to draw these congressional districts to put together a specific group of people, for example, all Hispanics and African Americans together in specific congressional districts, so they elect fewer representatives to the state House of Representatives, right? So there is a lot of debate about that in the media, and we will discuss here in the next slides. But overall, the reason why we have census in the US, the formal reason is written in the Constitution, that the number of representatives at the House from each state will be based on the size of the population of each state in the US. The 2020 census had a lot of controversies, right? So one that was not really out there in the media was the one that I just mentioned to you now, that the Census Bureau was planning to make changes to the race ethnicity question to combine them and to add Middle Eastern and North African, but that was blocked. But some other things happened right before and during the implementation of the 2020 census that might have compromised the quality and accuracy of the 2020 census. So first, there were delays in census operations due to the pandemic, to the COVID-19 pandemic. And the federal government decided to end activities on September 30th, 2020. And when you try to finish the activities faster than expected, usually the more vulnerable population, the ones that live more in farther away areas like rural areas or minorities that are harder to access, those usually tend to be undercounted. So by pushing on the deadline, and that's all the previous federal administration, the Trump administration. Whenever I'm saying previous federal administration, I'm talking about the Trump administration. They were pushing for the Census Bureau to stop the census quickly, but that would undercount exactly those vulnerable populations. And then, exactly because of that, at that time, Senators Brian Schatz and Lisa Murkowski, they introduced the 2020 Census Deadline Extensions Act, then required the Census Bureau to continue the activities for the census, the field operations, until October 31st, giving the census more time to collect and process data, which would lead them more time to collect information about the whole population, including the vulnerable groups, extended the deadline for the delivery of apportionment data to the US House of Representatives from December 31st to April 30th, 2021. So this is the first set of data, right? That the Census Bureau tells the House of Representatives what's the population in each one of these states. Because based on the population size of each one of these states, you know how many representatives those states will have at the House. And the other thing, it extended also the deadline from March to July in 2021 for data related to redistricting to each one of the state legislators. So it has to send to each one of the states information about the size of the population in specific sub-areas of the state. And based on that information, the state legislators, they can redraw the congressional districts. That's how it's done, okay? So this redrawing of congressional districts and also the number of representatives per state in the House, these changes are done every 10 years, all based on the previous census, okay? So now, in the midterm elections now in 2022, that we just had the primary this last Tuesday, and the election in November, this one will be the first election based on the redrawing of the 2020 census, okay? And so this is all really important things that happen in a continuous basis in the US whenever we have census being implemented. And this is data, again, that I got from the Census Bureau. This I got back in April. The US resident population living in the US based on data from the 2020 census. So the population increased. So this is the population living in 50 states and DC. The population increased from 308 million to more than 330 million in the US between 2010 and 2020. So it increased by 7.4%. And specifically about the apportionment population, that's people living in the 50 states, but excluding DC, and military, federal, civilian employees, and dependents living overseas are allocated to their home state. And this is reported by the employing federal agencies. So what the Census Bureau gets the population of all the US, excludes DC, only 50 states, get information from other federal agencies about military, federal employees, and dependents living outside, and allocate them to their home states where they live in the US. And that overall population that will be considered for all the redistricting of the redrawing of congressional districts was of around also 330 million people. But this number here decreases because DC is not included, but increases because we added these people, right? So that's why these numbers are different. And this is the apportionment of the US House of Representatives based on the 2020 census. Because proportionally the Texas population has been increasing faster than in other states in the US, Texas gained 2 seats in the House of Representatives. Some other states gained 1 seat. The states in white did not gain any one. And the ones in light purple lost 1 seat, right? Exactly because their population decreased in size between 2010 and 2020, okay? And the author of our textbook, Dudley Poston, he has even some research with his former graduate students in which he tries to make some estimations by the federal government pushing too much on not counting, for example, undocumented immigrants to count as the size of the population. What they expect, for example, would be that states like Texas that has a higher proportion of undocumented immigrants compared to other states, they would have fewer representatives in the House. Right? So by not counting those people, that would cause losses of representatives in specific states, such as Texas. But this is the count, and knowing that we have 435 US representatives, right? But these were the changes that we saw in overall numbers. And in one issue that we might get from the 2020 census was this push from the previous federal administration to stop the census activities really fast. Another controversial topic was that the federal government, the Trump administration, was trying to implement a question, to add a question about citizenship status. The American Community Survey has a question about citizenship status. It asks if the person is born in the US or is an American citizen, whether the person was naturalized citizen, and whether the person is not a citizen of the US. So when I first arrived here, I would answer the third option. And now that I became a citizen, I would be the second option. And that question is asked in the American Community Survey. There is no question in the American Community Survey about visa status. There is no question about that could capture whether the person is undocumented or not. So, but the federal administration, the Trump administration, what they wanted to do was to add that citizenship question that is in the American Community Survey into the census. The citizenship question, not related to visa status. And their argument was that we should count the population in the US in the census that it's citizen, those that are actually able to vote, in order to count the population to be counted towards the House of Representatives. But the problem is that the American Constitution does not say anything about the person having to count the population, the people who are citizens, to go into the apportionment process. The US Constitution just says, let's count the population overall. So their counter argument from the Trump administration was just like, oh, or their reasoning of adding this question, we want to count the number of people who are actually going to be able to vote. They are citizens, and they should be the ones that will be counted and taken into account to count for the House of Representatives. And people were denouncing them. Oh, no, actually, we're trying to do that because by adding that question, you will make less likely for families that have at least one undocumented immigrant living with them to answer the questionnaire. It's not directly asking the question if someone is undocumented immigrant or not, but just by having the question about citizenship status, it creates kind of a fear of some households to answer that question, to answer the questionnaire as a whole. And by doing that, you are undercounting those households with the political intent of counting only those people that are more pro, let's say pro the Republican Party. So that was the criticism from Democrats. Oh, you are just trying to prevent specific groups of people to answer because that will benefit you politically when you redraw the districts for the state legislators. And the Trump administration said, no, that's not true. That's not what we are trying to do. But then what's interesting, and this information here on this slide, I got it from this article from the New York Times. There was this Republican strategist, Thomas Hofeller, that he created all the overall strategy to he played a crucial role in the Trump administration decision to add a citizenship question to the 2020 census. And this reasoning that I'm giving here to you was not given in public by the Republican Party. What was interesting was like when he died, his daughter, she provided a series of information that were available in his hard drives and his computers to the public, in which actually he says in his notes that adding a citizenship question to the census would allow Republicans to draft even more extreme gerrymandering maps to increase the votes towards Republicans. So what they were trying to do, it was to count the population that would be more in favor of Republicans, and that population would be the one in which the state legislators would redraw the congressional districts, and that would benefit the Republicans. He wrote the key portion of a draft Justice Department letter claiming the question was needed to enforce the 1965 Voting Rights Act, the rationale the administration later used to justify its decision. So what is interesting about all this debate in relation to demography? We are saying, oh, we are just collecting information about the population, just counting how many people we have here. It might sound really simple, but it has really important political implications. And that is what is going on in terms of the public debate now. Understanding those reasons, understanding the arguments from both sides is important. And going in depth into that is important. Because this is showing how the simple way in which we create a questionnaire for the census to collect data about our population has political implications, okay? And just going through this process of gerrymandering. What is the issue of political gerrymandering? Is to draw the congressional districts, the ones that are drawn to select the state representatives, in a way that it favors candidates of one specific party. And redrawing the congressional districts is one of the functions of state legislators, right? Gerrymandering is against the law. Unless topography gets in the way, the districts are supposed to be contiguous, right? They're not supposed to have all different shapes trying to group specific groups of people together in order to elect more or fewer candidates of one party or the other. And some of the maps that I'm going to show here, they are not maps that were done with the 2020 census, that's before that. But just to give you an idea of how the boundaries of these congressional districts can have really weird shapes, right? So Alasdair Ray, a geographer and urban planner from the Sheffield University, he pretty much created the maps for all 435 congressional districts in the US. And that's before the these redrawings of the congressional districts that we saw now after the 2020 census. And just to give you an example, for example, in the case of North Carolina, a map with congressional districts that was drawn when the state legislators were ruled by Republicans packed African Americans and Hispanic voters into really few districts. So get all these different groups of African Americans and Hispanics who tend to vote more Democrat and put them all together in specific congressional districts so they would elect fewer state representatives, right? So back in 2010, Democrats won the popular vote and won 7 seats in the state legislature while Republicans won 6. But in 2012, after the redraw of the congressional districts based on the 2010 census, Democrats again won the popular vote, but Republicans won 9 seats in the state legislature, while Democrats only won 4, right? Although overall, if you count the population of the whole state, Democrats won the popular vote. And this is the 2010 congressional districts here. They were drawn based on the population from the 2000 census. The 2012 congressional districts, they were drawn based on the 2010 census. But the criticism is that the state legislature, when they were ruled by Republicans here in 2012 before the elections, they redraw the districts in a way that they put all these subgroups of the population that tend to be more Democrats in specific areas, and they would elect fewer representatives. So look at this district here. All these people here living together elected one representative. So it's 1 here, 2, 3, and 4, right? Against 9, as we saw here in the previous slide, 9 to 4. But these weird districts already existed before as well. But shaping the congressional districts based on race, ethnicity composition is against the law. But in order to prove that and win that injustice is always really complicated and takes a long time, right? So that's a major issue going on in the US now. And this is just an evolution of the specific 12th congressional district, which is this one here, how it changed the shape through time from 1993 until 2017, how it kept shaping, how it kept changing the shape over time, but just to show that drawing congressional districts in the US, it's an important political tool, at least the way that has been doing now with gerrymandering, which is against the law, okay? But here in Texas as well, you have, for example, the 114th congressional district around Houston. And one of the discussions that is, and I put here the one article that discussed about it, is that these congressional districts, they can have weird shapes. If those people, they in some way are living, are being benefited by the same policies implemented by the government, but drawing them based on race, ethnicity, composition, that it's not allowed by the law, okay? In Michigan, the same thing happens when you see, for example, Detroit and Flint that have a population that usually votes more pro-Democrats, but overall they're electing less state representatives because the way that the districts are drawn, the other ones with fewer people, they ended electing Republicans. So you have more Republicans in the state legislature in Michigan than Democrats, okay? And here's like dark red is more than 60% of the vote for Republicans, light red less than 60%, and the same thing for Republicans, dark blue and light blue. Cool, so really interesting discussion is that collecting data for the census might sound kind of naive. Oh, we just want to know about our population, about the composition, so we can implement policies to improve their life standards. But in the US, that's really clear exactly because it's written in the Constitution, it can be used for political gains, okay? The second source, typical source of data that we have overall in the world are the registration systems. So a population registration system is a national list of persons with their names, addresses, dates of birth, and personal identification numbers. The personal identification number in the US is Social Security number, right? And these registration systems are systems that different countries have that collect on a continuous basis information about people dying, people being born, people getting married, people getting divorced, and so on. So vital statistics are data from civil registration systems, as well as from actual records of vital events. And it's, again, collected on a regular basis. In terms of data collected in all the world, there were registered in the registration systems of different countries, a total of 57 million. No, it's estimated that around 57 million births back in 2012 were not actually reported into the agencies within countries. So they were not actually counted as births for those countries. So you still have a huge issue with registration systems in developing countries in which people are born and die, and they are never reported to the government. So fertility and death rates are underestimated, right? Of course, this problem of unregistration, it's more common in developing countries, not the case of the US. So the percentage of children under 5, it's estimated that around 230 million children were not registered in any system, according to data from UNICEF in 2013. 90% of the children under age 5 are registered in industrialized countries. Of course, this percentage is even higher in the US. But on the other hand, for example, less than 20% of children under age 5 are registered in sub-Saharan Africa. So you still have, if you just go to the registration system in countries in sub-Saharan Africa, and based on that data, you're trying to understand fertility, you will underestimate fertility rates in the countries, in those countries, okay? Deaths, only 25% of the world population lives in countries with 90% of more of deaths registered. And usually countries that have at least 90% of deaths reported to the government, to an agency, to a public agency, the ones that report at least 90% are usually developed countries, high-income countries, okay? Vital records or responsibilities of the clergy in the 17th century England. And this practice was followed by the English colonies in North America. So collecting data about babies being born and about people dying. It was kind of started in England, implemented by the clergy, and the same thing implemented here in the US. Individual US states are now the legal authorities. So it started this way, but now the US states are the legal authorities. All US states had birth and death records on file by 1919. So we have a lot of historic information there. And the country implemented those registration areas at the national level that get the data from state agencies and compile them for the whole country. So the death registration area was implemented in 1900, birth registration area in 1915, national registration areas for marriage in 57, and for divorce in 58. So what happens, for example, if someone is born, someone in the hospital, usually a representative of the county, gives a questionnaire, a form, to the parents whenever the baby was born, and then one of the parents, they fill out the form, provide information, name of the parents, usually age, sometimes education, and information about the kid, and also race, ethnicity. And then we give it back to that person or to the hospital sends it to the county agency, and then they send it to the state, and afterwards the state sends it to the national registration area. So birth and death data are sent by the states to the National Center of Health Statistics, who compiles data for the whole US, okay? What exactly have the birth certificates? Like I just said, has the names and ages of parents, their occupations, and sometimes level of education. Is filled out by the physician, midwife, or mother or father. I fill out the ones for my children, for example. Death certificates. So it has information about the age, occupation, place of death, and cause of death of the person. And it's filled out by funeral homes with personal information about the descendant provided by a surviving family member, a physician, or a coroner, okay? And again, what is birth and what is death. We have to come up with really specific concepts to detail what is birth and what is death in order to have the correct counts to be reported to the public agency, to be reported to the national registration areas afterwards. That's why, as discussed in the textbook, we have to have specific information about what is death and what is birth. So fetal death, the disappearance of life prior to live birth, which includes miscarriages, abortions, and stillbirth. Miscarriages, spontaneous or accidental termination of fetal life that occurs early in pregnancy. Abortions, premature expulsion of a fetus, spontaneous or induced at a time before it is viable of sustaining life. Stillbirths, late fetal deaths of 28 weeks or more of gestation. And here's something interesting, like we usually see, I remember in the 2016 presidential debate between Clinton and Trump. And Trump said, oh, we see nowadays people performing abortion on the day of the delivery. You see there, the day that the baby is supposed to be born, is performed an abortion. If it's that late in the pregnancy, as he's saying, that's not an abortion. That's a baby being born dead. That's stillbirth, late fetal death of 28 weeks or more of gestation. That's not an abortion, right? Why is that important? Because that will tell us the percentage or the rates of abortion that we have in the country, the rates of stillbirths. That's why it's important to explain, to know exactly what these terms mean, okay? Death, the permanent disappearance of all evidence of life at any time after live birth has taken place. So that's after someone is born, right? But here I just wanted to emphasize this difference between abortion and stillbirth. If someone has a C-section at the time they're supposed to have, and then baby is born, comes out dead, is not an abortion. Stillbirth. Birth, extraction from its mother of a product of conception which breathes or shows any evidence of life, right? Again, all this information, indicators, and specific examples that people find out there can be used for religious, ideological, and political purposes. We have to be careful of how we measure and analyze these indicators because we are doing science here and that's what matters, right? We are not using this data to push a specific political agenda. We are using this data to understand our population and then try to implement some policies that would benefit that population, okay? And as you're gonna, in the extra readings, about the chapter about family and sexuality. There's a chapter about that in the textbook. You're going to see that the incidence of abortions in the US, for example, the data that's available in the lecture, it's really in the first few weeks of gestation. Is not late, as is usually said in the public discourse in the media. So what the data is showing is exactly opposite of how usually religious and more conservative political groups use in order to make their point. And then we have to be careful about that because we care about actual facts, actual data being counted from the population. So this is just a summary of the differences between censuses and registration systems. Census We go in a specific year, in a specific time point, and we collect information about the population of a specific country. It's cross-sectional. Remember the axis diagram, right? Time, horizontal axis, age, vertical axis. If I follow the same people over time, I have the diagonal here, longitudinal. Here for the census, I cut all these different sections, all these different cohorts. It's cross-sectional. I'm getting data for a specific year for my whole population in that specific year. And then I can get information about the size, composition, right? Sex, race, ethnicity, home ownership, and so on. Characteristics of the household. And distribution, right? I know where these people live. So it's static, collecting a specific time point. In the US, the authority is done by the federal government, the US Census Bureau. And is de jure, is which people were the usual residents in that household in the census day, in April 1st of that census year. The registration systems, we measure demographic events like births, deaths, marriage also, divorce, at the time that they happen, right? At the time that they occur. So it's more dynamic, continuous. What's the authority that collects that data? The state governments. And of course, the state government afterwards provide that to federal agencies. And it's also based on a de jure data collection form, in the way that you get the residence of those people at the time that their children were born or their relatives died, where they usually lived, right? That's the place of residence. So we can count, we can better understand fertility and mortality, for example, based on the usual place of residence. Cool. And the third set of demographic data, of source of demographic data, are the surveys. And before I talk about surveys, I just do this little introduction here that's not in the textbook about inferential statistics. Just to explain that usually scientists, social scientists, what we want to do is to analyze a specific population more in depth. We want a lot of information about them, right? But the census collects really few questions about them, right? Name, age, sex, race, ethnicity, household composition, and so on. Really few questions. So usually what social scientists want is to ask more questions about those people to answer their research questions. We want longer questionnaires. And we have to do that with our own research money. We can apply for a grant with a foundation or with a public institution or so on. But when we get that money, it's still really expensive to collect data about the whole population of people. So what we usually do, we collect information from a sample of that population. But the sample of the population has to be representative to the whole population, right? So I have to get people answering my questionnaire from different age groups, different race, ethnicity groups, different sex, different places of residence, and so on, different neighborhoods, right? And that's, for example, what we see in election polls. Election polls, like 1,000, 2,000 people only are interviewed for the whole country, and then we estimate how much candidate A or B will receive of votes. So we are getting a sample of the whole population of people who vote, of voters, but that sample has to be representative. If it's not representative, my data is not, I'm not able to generalize the result to the whole population, right? So we almost never have the resources or time to collect data from everyone in the population. So what we do, how do we select the people to answer our questionnaire? We have to follow this procedure of a survey design, usually with the help of statisticians, that help us collect data from different people. And then we're going to have a survey that's representative to the whole group. And this technique in which we get data from a small group of people that's representative to the whole population is called inferential statistics. Inferential statistics, I'm getting data from a sample, a group, a subgroup of people, and I'm saying the average information about this group here, this subgroup, is the average information for the whole population, right? So the population is the total collection of all cases in which we are interested. If I collected data for the whole population, that was a census. I don't have money for that. I will collect data from a subgroup, from a sample, right? So the samples are carefully chosen subsets of the population with proper techniques, generalizations based on samples can represent the populations. So what we want is information from samples that can be used. The average income that I found in my sample, I expect to be the average income of my population. The proportion of non-Hispanic white, of non-Hispanic African Americans, of or Hispanic people in my sample, I expect to see the same proportion in my population. And the indicators that I estimate from my sample are called statistics. The indicators that I would have estimated if I had the census, if I had data from my whole population, those would be parameters. But I don't have the parameters. Parameters are the indicators if I had collected information from everybody. Since I collect only for a specific group of people, I have the statistics. So I use the statistics to estimate the parameters. Okay? So with this technique, I'm able to implement surveys. I collect a subgroup of the population sample, and for that subgroup of the population, I can create a more detailed questionnaire to answer my research questions or to help answer my research questions. And then I implement that survey into my sample. So surveys are required for the collection of more detailed demographic information that is not contained on census and registration systems. There are extensive kinds of information available through sample surveys. And some examples is, for example, the demographic and health surveys. If you say DHS to a demographer, the demographer will think about demographic health survey, not Department of Homeland Security, right? So it depends on who you talk to. So the demographic and health surveys are usually implemented in developing countries, collecting data on fertility and reproductive health, usually collected among women. Some other examples of fertility surveys have been implemented in previous years. A country that has really a large set of data being collected, all sorts of surveys, but specifically about reproductive health is Mexico. They have a family planning program implemented since the 70s in rural communities. So they want to understand the impact of those policies, though they have many surveys being implemented to test whether their policies are working. In the US, I mentioned already the American Community Survey, implemented every year, which used to be the long questionnaire from the census. The current population survey asks questions towards people, adults with at least 18 years of age, but it's asked every year. It follows the same, it implements the same questionnaire in a household for 4 months. That household gets out for 8 months and then goes back for 4 additional months. So you can do some longitudinal analysis through time. Since it's a more complex survey design, it has a smaller sample size than the American Community Survey. The National Survey of Family Growth, also longitudinal, and Ed Health, also longitudinal. So the American Community Survey is pretty much, it took the long form census from the long form from the census, and now is implemented every year. And I will go more in detail about these surveys implemented in the US, and also show some links about where to collect some data, demographic data on Tuesday. On Tuesday, then I continue on the following chapter. And then on Thursday, we're gonna have exam 2, okay? So thank you very much. Have a great weekend, and I see you guys on Tuesday.